Let me tell you a little bit about how I got involved in research on self-compassion. For me, it's definitely a personal journey. It was my last year doing my PhD at the University of Berkeley in California, and I was under a lot of stress. All right, stress about finishing my PhD, stress about getting a job after finishing my PhD, and I also had a lot of personal issues going on in my life that were causing me stress, shame, self-criticism. I had just gotten through a divorce and a lot of stuff was stirred up. So I thought I'd learn how to meditate, right? Meditation is good for stress, I knew that. But what surprised me is the very first night I went to the meditation course, the woman leading the course talked about the importance not only of compassion for others, but of compassion for oneself, being kind, supportive, caring toward oneself. And it's not an exaggeration to say at that moment my life changed course, that I realized I had this resource, that I could be kind, and I really needed it at the time. I could be kind and supportive to myself, and it really made a difference. So what happened is when I did get a job, I got a job at University of Texas, I decided I wanted to do research on self-compassion. And a lot of people had written about self-compassion. Just to be honest, I come from the Buddhist tradition, but in a lot of traditions, this is a theme. But at that point, no one had done any empirical research on it. So that's kind of where I started. So really, my first task was to try to define precisely what I meant, or what I meant by self-compassion. You don't have to agree with me. So my own personal definition of self-compassion. And from my point of view, self-compassion is not different than compassion for others as an experience. It's just that very, very often we cut ourselves out of the circle of compassion. We're compassionate towards others, but not necessarily toward ourselves. So I like to kind of start thinking about what self-compassion is by thinking about what the experience of compassion for others entails. So you're walking down a busy street, and this woman is by the side of the road. What has to happen for you to have compassion for her? Well, the first thing that happens, again, if you're walking down the road texting or worrying about your work meeting, you have to notice her in order to have compassion for her. And more than just notice her, you have to notice that she's suffering, okay, that she's struggling, she's having a hard time. And the second thing that has to happen is your heart needs to respond in some way. You care about her suffering. I mean, some people might notice her and get annoyed, get that bum off the street. But if you have compassion, you think, wow, is she getting the mental health services she needs? What's her story? And thirdly, this is really key, and for me this differentiates compassion from pity. Is there but for the grace of God go I? She's a human being, I'm a human being. I'm not looking down on her. I'm not feeling sorry for her. I'm really realizing that we all suffer. She's suffering, but in different circumstances, that could be me. Okay, so the three-component model of self-compassion that I published back in 2003 has these same exact three elements. All right. So the first is the response of the heart, self-kindness, as opposed to harsh self-judgment. The idea is we treat ourselves with care and understanding rather than harsh self-judgment when we fail or make a mistake or we're suffering in some way. It's funny, we talked about the golden rule, do unto others as you would have others do unto you. Well, that's great, but do not do to others what you do to yourself, right? Because we are so hard on ourselves often. Again, we're even cruel to ourselves. We're often our own worst enemy. As you saw in the clip, we say things to ourselves that we wouldn't even say to people we didn't like very much. I'm ashamed of you. You're a failure. You're such a fat loser. Things like that. I mean, that's what we say to ourselves, and hopefully we don't say that to others. So the idea is with self-compassion, we're kind, we're supportive and caring. But again, as Chris mentioned, there's an action element to compassion. There's a motivation to help. So we also engage in active self-soothing and comforting ourselves and caring for ourselves when we're suffering. All right, the second component is this common humanity. Okay, realizing that everybody is imperfect, everybody suffers, everyone has imperfect lives. And of course, rationally, we all know that. But what happens irrationally, emotionally, when we fail, we get rejected, or we get that diagnosis, it feels like something has gone wrong. This is not supposed to be happening. This is abnormal in some way. It's just an emotional reaction. And that feeling that this shouldn't be happening makes us feel isolated, as if somehow everyone else in the world is living these perfectly happy, normal lives, and it's just me who's experiencing this right now. And what happens is that makes us feel isolated and cut off, and that adds insult to injury, because not only are we suffering, we feel alone in our suffering. But if you give yourself compassion, that common humanity component, you realize everyone suffers. It's really quite beautiful. Every moment of suffering becomes a moment, an opportunity for connection with others. All right. And then the third component is the noticing, which is the mindfulness. Oftentimes we don't want to look at our suffering. We want to avoid it. We want to resist it. But to open our hearts to ourselves, we have to be able to turn toward our suffering, see it clearly as it is, acknowledge it. But we want to do this in a balanced way. We don't want to, run away or wallow in our suffering, which I call over-identification. Oh my God, I gained 3 pounds. Life is coming to an end. So with mindfulness, we just see things clearly as they are, no more and no less. Sometimes people say, but what do you mean notice your suffering? Isn't that obvious? If you really start to look at it, we often don't notice our suffering. First of all, self-criticism is one of the most constant and pervasive forms of suffering we experience. But for many of us, that voice in our head it's like in the background. It's always there, and we don't even notice that we've internalized this voice of criticism. And so part of self-compassion is listening. Wow, did I really just say that to myself? Would I say that to a friend? And if not, maybe I can change the way I speak to myself. Or if something happens that we don't blame ourselves for, and we blame ourselves for most things, but maybe, let's say you get rear-ended on the freeway, we often go straight into problem-solving fix-it mode. I mean, if a friend got rear-ended on the freeway, you might say, oh my God, that's terrible, give me a hug. That must have been so hard. We often don't pause to give ourselves that type of care, concern, and support when we need it most. All right, I just want to give you a little experience of these 3 components of self-compassion. So if you can just put your papers and pens down for a moment. All right, so the first thing I'd like everyone to do is put your hands out in front of you and clench your fists. Okay? All right. What comes up for you when you do this? What kind of feelings or emotions get evoked? Just yell it out loudly. Anger. Tension. Right? Stress. It doesn't feel very good. Well, this is what it feels like when we criticize ourselves. Right? This is what we go through a lot of the day with this in our minds. But now open your hands like this. And what changes? Breath. I think that was openness, right? Kind of more relaxation. So this is a gesture of mindfulness. What happens when we stop fighting our experience and just allow things to be as they are? Now put your hands forward like this. All right, what gets evoked when we do this gesture for you? Openness. Welcoming. Vulnerable, receptive. Right, so you might say this is a gesture of this common humanity, kind of giving and receiving. Generosity often comes up. But now I'd like everyone to put one hand over the other and place both hands over the center of your chest. All right, and really feel that for a moment. You maybe even want to close your eyes. Feel the warmth of your hands, the kind of gentle touch and pressure. You maybe even notice the beating of your heart. All right, so what comes up for you when you make that gesture? Soothing. Tenderness. Kindness, right. So as you probably guessed, this is a gesture of self-kindness or perhaps self-compassion altogether. Okay. Feels pretty good, huh? So there's a reason why there's these fairly reliable responses, and kind of going back to what Chris Irons mentioned, this is based on a lot of the work of Paul Gilbert. The physiological underpinning of self-criticism is this reptilian brain, the threat defense system. Okay, as you know, the system evolved to protect our bodily cells, to run away when the lion was chasing us. Very effective system, releases cortisol, adrenaline, helps us get ready for the fight or flight response. The problem is the system evolved primarily to protect ourselves against bodily threat. In today's world, most of the threats are to our self-concept, our beliefs about ourselves. So when we fail or we feel inadequate, the same system gets triggered. And we get into this fight or flight mode. The problem is when we fight the problem, we're actually fighting ourselves because the threat's to our self-concept. So with self-criticism, it's a double whammy because we are both the attacker and the attacked. And that's why self-criticism is associated with huge amounts of cortisol, stress, eventually depression as the system shuts down, right, to react to all the stress. And it's a very unhealthy mind state. But again, we aren't just reptiles, we're also mammals. So this mammalian caregiving system evolved where in order for the mammalian young to stay safe, a system had to evolve where there's a reaction to warmth, gentle touch, and gentle vocalizations that make us feel warm, that make us feel soothed, calm, and safe. And so when we do this, one of the reasons it feels so good is because we're tapping into this system. We don't know this for sure, but we may be releasing things like oxytocin and opiates. And actually, just as a little tip, if you're feeling like you need some self-compassion, this is a really powerful gesture that instantly, even if your mind can't go there, your body often responds to this physical act of self-soothing and self-care. All right, I want to go over a little bit the research on self-compassion. Most of it is not conducted with test tubes. I have test tube envy, okay? A lot of it, not all, this is really changing, but a lot of it is done with a scale I developed to measure self-compassion. And it's really just kind of face valid statements of how you behave that correspond to self-kindness, self-judgment, common humanity, isolation, mindfulness, over-identification. Right. By the way, if anyone's interested, you can go to my website, Google self-compassion, you'll find it, and you can take the self-compassion scale and get a score for how self-compassionate you are. And it's really exciting for me to see how research on self-compassion has exploded recently. Okay, so this is just kind of an informal graph I put together, but you can see in 2003, that's when my first two papers came out. And now there's over probably 200 dissertations and published journal articles looking at self-compassion, really nice exponential growth curve. So you say there's a lot of interest in science on the benefits of self-compassion. And just to broadly summarize, right, we know self-compassion is strongly linked to well-being. Strongly linked, there was actually a meta-analysis looking at a bunch of studies, a strong effect size, where self-compassion is negatively linked to depression, anxiety, and stress. Okay. Also things like perfectionism, negative body image, really a whole host of negative states are predicted by the fact that you have less self-compassion. So you might say self-compassion alleviates some of the suffering of these negative states. But there's an equally strong relationship between self-compassion and positive states like happiness, like optimism, and things like life satisfaction. And that always, it's so beautiful to me about self-compassion. What it's doing, self-compassion is really embracing suffering, embracing your own suffering. So what you're doing is you're alleviating the suffering to some degree, you're reducing these negative states. But what is compassion? Another way of saying the three elements of kindness, common humanity, and mindfulness is loving, connected presence, right? When we can hold our suffering in this space of loving, connected presence, that's a really positive emotion. So it increases the positive at the same time that it reduces the negative. A lot of research now, and thank you, Chris, for going over some of the studies, I can leave it out, showing that self-compassion is linked to motivation. This research is absolutely essential because I would say perhaps the number one block to people being more self-compassionate is they really believe that they need harsh self-criticism to motivate themselves. They're afraid that if they're too self-compassionate, I'll just skip work, stay home, eat a whole entire tub of Ben & Jerry's ice cream. The research shows just the opposite. And it's actually easy to see if we think about, for instance, how parents best motivate their children. Okay, so let's say there's a child that comes home with a failing grade in math. And the mother has two ways to motivate that child to try to do better next time. The first is with harsh judgment and criticism. Again, the mother says something like, "You failed? I'm ashamed of you. You're a loser. You'll never amount to anything." Right? It makes you cringe, but as I said, we often say just the exact type thing to ourselves. And what that response is going to do is make the son probably lose faith in himself, feel really anxious, I can't do it, and maybe even give up math altogether. Okay, but what if the mother has a compassionate response? First thing she says when the child shows her the F is, "Oh man, oh gosh, I'm sorry. Oh, it hurts so bad to fail. Give me a hug. I love you anyway. It's okay. Everyone fails sometimes." But how can we learn from this experience? I love you, I want to support you, and I know you want to go to college, you need to get your math grades up. How can I help you reach your goals? And that type of supportive encouragement is actually more likely to help us reach our goals, to motivate us. Self-compassion, a lot of research now showing it's linked to health behaviors like exercise, diet, quitting smoking, not drinking so much. Again, another myth of self-compassion is that it's self-indulgent. It just means giving pleasure to yourself, like eating that entire tub of Ben & Jerry's. But of course, if you care about yourself, you aren't going to want to engage in behaviors that cause suffering. You're going to want to engage in behaviors that lead to health and well-being. Again, a mother doesn't say, skip school to her kid, do whatever you want. That would be indulgent. A compassionate mother says, do your homework, go to bed on time, eat your vegetables, because she cares. Again, a lot of research showing that self-compassion is linked to more personal accountability, right? More a willingness to take responsibility for mistakes, more conscientiousness, more likelihood to apologize and try to repair mistakes. Again, this busts another myth, which is that a lot of people think if I give myself compassion, I'm just letting myself off the hook. I'm not, it's only human, It's actually just the opposite, because if we are a habitual self-critic and we say, I did something hurtful, therefore I am a terrible person, we aren't going to want to take responsibility. It's much easier for me to blame you, right? But if we have self-compassion, if we know it's safe to admit that we made a mistake, then we're much more likely to take responsibility and therefore to do something about it. A lot of research now showing that self-compassion is strongly linked to coping and resilience. There's a really nice study by David Zabara looking at people who are just going through a divorce. And just to give you a little sample of some of the new methodologies coming out that are so clever, he had people come into his lab and just talk for 5 minutes about what they were going through. And he had his graduate students code how self-compassionate the statements were using my scale. And what he found is that 9 months later, self-compassion was by far the single most important predictor of how people were coping with their divorce. Okay, things like vets. Oh, sorry, I'm not supposed to say vets. That's animal doctors here. Veterans coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq. Actually, a dissertation student of mine did this study. Found that people's level of self-compassion about what happened, a lot of PTSD with veterans, found that the level of self-compassion was more predictive of whether or not they would develop PTSD than the level of combat exposure they had. So in other words, it's not just what you experience, it's how you relate to that experience, especially when that experience is so painful. All right. Also some research showing that it actually reduces things like chronic back pain. We just published a study looking at self-compassion in romantic relationships. And all I can say, if any of you are on the dating market, have your potential partner go to my website, fill out the self-compassion, test, ask for their score before you agree. Maybe not, maybe after a few dates. Because we know that self-compassion strongly predicts positive relationship behavior. People who are more self-compassionate are more caring, they're more intimate, they're less controlling, they get less angry at their partners. And of course it makes sense. If we are expecting our partner to meet all our needs exactly as we want them to be met, good luck. Right? It's not going to happen. You're going to get pissed off about it, right? It's going to lead to more disconnection. But if we can meet a lot of these needs for ourselves, right? Give ourselves some of the caring support we need, we're going to have more to be able to give to others. There's not a lot of research on this, but this interesting question. Are people who are more self-compassionate more compassionate to others? Well, we know pretty strongly that if you're more self-compassionate, you're more forgiving of others, and you're more likely to be able to take their perspectives. In terms of compassion, empathy, and altruism, the relationship isn't nearly as strong as you would expect, and among young people, college undergraduates, there's no relationship whatsoever. Okay. Even among practicing Buddhists, there's only a really small relationship. What's happening? People say you have to be compassionate to yourself before you can be compassionate to others. It doesn't actually seem to be the case in that how many people do you know, and some of you may be these people, who are really kind, caring, loving people towards others and are really harsh to themselves. Okay, so there's often a big discrepancy between how we treat others and how we treat ourselves. And that discrepancy is actually a little bit stronger for women. Women are more compassionate to others than men. Sorry, guys, but a lot of research about this. And they're a little less self-compassionate than men are. Okay, so part of self-compassion is actually, again, learning to treat yourself like those we care about. And so this comes to the issue of, so you can have compassion for others, I believe, without having a lot of self-compassion, but it's not going to be as sustainable. Okay, your batteries are going to run dry. And there is a little bit of research now, hopefully it'll grow, showing that people who have self-compassion are less likely to suffer burnout and compassion fatigue, right, or empathy fatigue. And they're more satisfied with their caregiving role. And I've got some data, I've had it for like a couple years, I still haven't written it up yet, but on self-compassion among parents of autistic children. And again, kind of like with the veterans, what it shows is that the level of self-compassion parents have is a better predictor of how well they're coping with their child's autism than the severity of their child's autism itself. So this is something I know from my personal experience. As I mentioned, my passion about self-compassion comes from my own life. My son is autistic. Actually, some of you may have read the book or seen the film The Horse Boy, about our family's journey to Mongolia with our autistic son. So I know a lot about how self-compassion can basically save your ass when you're really stressed. Okay, so many times self-compassion helped me deal with this difficult situation. When I first got the diagnosis, for instance, when feelings came up that I thought I wasn't supposed to have, like disappointment, how can I be disappointed in my son? I love him more than anyone else in the world. Self-compassion allowed me to feel it's only human to feel this way. Can I hold it? Can I embrace it with love and kindness? And then much more quickly, those feelings were able to pass. Also in times when, all kids tantrum, but autistic kids, a lot of them really tantrum to a much later age. Just to tell you a story of how self-compassion helped me cope, I remember one time I was actually flying to England with my son, and he was 4 years old, and I don't know what set him off, but he threw a doozy of a tantrum on the plane, just at that moment when everyone's finally getting to sleep, he's kicking and flailing, and of course everyone's looking at him because he looks normal. What is wrong with that kid? What is wrong with that mother? Why can't she shut that boy up? So everyone's looking at us like this. And of course I did feel bad. I felt bad we were disturbing them. Okay, what am I going to do? Looked at the window. It's locked. Damn it. It's not an option. Okay, I know, very clever. I'll take him to the bathroom. Maybe it'll kind of muffle his cries, right? So I went to the little toilet, and of course it was occupied. Of course it was occupied. So just imagine me here in that little tiny space outside the toilet with a screaming, tantruming 4-year-old. And at that moment, I just gave up. I realized I have no control over this situation. This is just happening. But what I did have was self-compassion. So while I was in that situation, I was just giving myself so much love and kindness and compassion. This is so hard. I don't feel like I can cope. I feel like I'm out of control. And what happened is when I kept my heart open to myself in that way, I was able to keep my heart open to my son. Okay, I didn't shut off. I didn't just get stressed out and overwhelmed. I felt this love and compassion for myself, and then I could include my son in that love and compassion. And over again, I find this pattern. If you can keep your heart open to yourself, you can keep your heart open to others. And basically, all I can say is self-compassion is a wonderful resource. It's like walking around with a little guardian angel on your shoulder or your best friend in your pocket, supporting you, encouraging you, caring for you when you need it most. And 3 a.m. when your best friend's asleep, you can rely on self-compassion to get you through. Okay, and just to end, I do have a website. If you just Google self-compassion, it comes up. I've tried to make it a free resource. Again, you can take the test, but I have videos on self-compassion, a TED Talk, the PDFs of a bunch of research articles, guided meditations, and also exercises. So hopefully, if some of you are interested, you can learn more at this site.